Bowers Wilkins have sold over 1 million pairs of 600 range speakers in the 20 some odd years that they have been in production. Over 1 million sets or pairs of speakers. That's got to be one of the best selling speaker ranges of all time, at least within the high end home hi-fi space. And I remember back to the early days of this channel, I had here to review the 603 S2 speakers. And I watched that review again to remind myself of what I thought about them. And it's interesting because pretty much everything I said about the S2, I think very similar things about the new S3. I also wanted to memory jog myself on the price because we all know the prices of everything has gone up drastically in the last few years, and the Bowers 603 S3 are no exception to that rule, costing just shy of £2,000. And that is quite a bit more than the S2 cost back in 2018 when I reviewed them. I do think the new 603 S3 look really nice. There's just something sleek and slick about them visually. And I cannot fault their build quality, but we don't get a very lavish finish here with probably the most popular colour, which will be black. There is a finish that has wood on the sides and white on the front. I think that would have looked really nice in this particular listening room. And you know what, it is what it is. I think if you're expecting it, or if you're used to maybe like a fancy glossy type of finish, we definitely don't get that here. But the flip side of that is, thinking back, and it was obviously a long time ago, I don't remember the S2 speakers feeling anywhere near as heavy or as solid or as well built as the new S3 do. Actually, when you wrap your knuckles on them, it's really quite surprising just how inert the cabinet is. And I did it from the top to the bottom. It's really surprising. So those were my first obvious positive first impressions. The speakers were heavy, they felt really heavy, they felt really solid. And not all speakers do, some speakers feel quite hollow, these don't, these feel really heavy. And again, wrap your knuckles on them pretty much everywhere and you'll be really surprised by how inert they are. I could make a pretty good guesstimation about how they were going to sound because there is a lot here that is familiar, but there is also some things here that are new. Probably the biggest new thing to talk about will be the all titanium dome tweeter, which features a 25 micron thick dome, and that's about a third of the thickness of a human hair. The tweeter has a titanium ring for improved bracing, a longer rear tapering tube inside that better absorbs the unwanted rear sound waves that's created by the tweeter, and the new more open weave grille design that I first saw on the new 800 signature speakers last year when I was at the Bowers factory. And the tweeter also sits closer to the mid-range driver on the baffle. And you could say from here, it's all about trickle-down technologies because Bowers say the 6-inch continuum cone FST mid-range driver and the dual 6.5-inch paper bass drivers get the same motor assemblies from the 700 range drivers, which is nice. The crossovers get the improved bypass capacitor treatment that Bowers have been putting into all of their newer ranges of speaker crossovers, which is again nice. On the rear are the more modern and much nicer speaker cable terminals, which I definitely prefer, and I already mentioned the obvious improved cabinet bracing. So Bowers Wilkins, maybe 600 range speaker enthusiasts, I'm sure will be thinking that this new 603 S3 will be the most refined 603 that Bowers have produced. And that is a really interesting phrase, or maybe a target to think about, because I think it's possible to make a speaker so refined, or to refine it so much that it maybe loses some fun factor. And that was definitely something that I was thinking about when I came into the listening part of this review. I have been listening to the 603 for a good few weeks now as I hurt my neck and my back. I think moving the speakers into this room in the first place, like I said, they were heavier than I was expecting them to be. And strangely maybe, I do like the fact that the 603 have this kind of flat bass, which is really easy to move around on carpet. So I could put them roughly where I thought they would be good, and then spend about a week maybe listening to them like that and just fine tuning their position for towing and for, time alignment with each other to get it, just right. Now, while we're on that, I actually found the 603 very easy to set up. There was nothing really too difficult here. For towing, I like a lot of towing normally with speakers, but with these, I found it was possible to maybe go too far and then compress the sound. Then once spiked, I found that their sound quality improved further still. And I have been listening to a lot of vinyl with them. And then in the last week or so, I have been ringing the changes with lots of different amplifiers and testing all sorts of things. So let's start with their overall big strengths. And the first one for me, and the obvious one for me, is their clarity. You never once feel like when you're listening to them that you're struggling to hear, that you're trying to hear the details. The details are always presented really clearly across the full soundstage. And that seems like a really small thing, but it's really not. Some speakers will maybe taper certain regions of the sound off. Others will just soften parts of the sound off. And that means sometimes you're trying to hear the details. With the Bowers, they're not really like that. I feel like they're designed as speakers to really get the sound out, to sound fast, to sound lively, to sound clear. And the 603 S3 did that exceptionally well. And it's in that vein where their next big strength really stood out to me. And that is with their overall three-dimensional soundstage delivery. Sound that very obviously comes from outside of the speakers, sound that very obviously comes out into the room, and then the most impressive one, sound that very obviously comes from, or you perceive it as coming from, very much beyond the speakers, really quite far beyond the speakers, with fantastic focus and tautness to the sound. So like the clarity that I mentioned before, that extends all the way through the soundstage delivery, right out to you and right beyond the speakers. And that is really very, very impressive for this kind of level of speaker. But really, I have to remind myself, this is now a £2,000 give or take speaker. So we should expect that, and I do expect that from them. But I think that the Bowers 603 S3 did it better than I was expecting for them and for their price point. Really, really very impressive three-dimensional soundstage. And their sound really is tightly focused from top to bottom, treble right through to the bass. Every note is composed and articulate and very serious. Maybe a little too serious at times. I have to applaud Bowers for making technically better and better speakers. But they and every other manufacturer should remember that music is supposed to be fun, and it's definitely not something that you always want to analyze. Bowers speakers do have a bit of a reputation for being brighter sounding speakers, and I can see why some people might think that, and I can see why some people might think that about the 603 S3 as well, depending on what equipment you put before them. And I have, access to some really high-end gear in here. I'm really lucky in that regard. But I did throw in a whole variety of different amplifiers and bits and pieces here. And I actually did not find them bright at all, really. But I do have an acoustically treated listening room, which is something to think about. But I did find that their vocal region could be maybe just a little bit crispy. Now, they're quite lively, energetic, and quite crisp sounding speakers in the main, but it was the vocal region, the sibilance region, which I'm really sensitive to. Now, this was not for all music, just for music that had very obvious sibilance in it anyway, and it could be just a little bit crispy. However, that was really dependent on the amplifier and setup that I was using, and I've got some really great recommendations to give you in a second. But I think you should consider the 603 S3 as high-end, high-performance speakers, so they will need good gear to sound as they should. That doesn't mean it has to be crazy expensive, but I think you definitely want good quality hi-fi components with speakers that are this clear and this transparent. I didn't find them particularly difficult speakers to drive either, which is not surprising with their rated 90 decibels of sensitivity at 8 ohms, but it does say on the spec sheet that they drop down to 3 ohms. So again, that's something to be mindful of. Again, you want a good amplifier with them. Maybe it could be perceived, or they could be perceived as more difficult to drive, I think because they have a very neutral profile, especially neutral through their bass region. I actually think it's borderline at times a leaner sound, again, it just depends on the amplifier and setup that you're using. If you're familiar with Bowers Wilkins speakers, all the modern ones have been like it to me. It's a very neutral sound. That means when the bass is heavy in the music, yeah, it's heavy, but sometimes when it's not, yeah, I find them to be just ever so slightly too lean. It just depends, I suppose. It depends on your taste, your preference, and probably your placement. I think the 603 have been designed with modern living in mind, which means people will probably be placing them quite close to the walls or quite close to corners of the room, which will give them more bass, and it means speakers will still work in smaller rooms as well. And the bass overall, I would say it's very Bowers and Wilkins. It's very tight, it's very focused, very articulate, very precise, difficult to fault really for the quality, but it's definitely not the same kind of big warming type of bass that some other speakers might give you. The vocals were also presented very clearly and cleanly, and at times in a really quite 3D holographic nature, which I really enjoyed and was very impressed by. And their overall soundstage capability I mentioned before is extremely impressive for the money, even at the $2,000 price level. And I did the bulk of the review with the biggest system I have here at the moment, which is the bespoke audio passive preamplifier feeding into the Griffin Essence stereo power amplifier. And that was mostly because I was injured and I couldn't move the nearly 60 kilograms worth of amplifier to try amplifiers that are more price appropriate. And I actually think that this setup was too neutral for the Bowers, and I wanted an amplifier that had a bit more of an obvious warm character. So I tried two and did a whole host of testing with the Audiolab 9000A and the criminally good for the money Musical Fidelity A1. And interestingly, with the smoothness of the Audiolab and its slightly forgiving nature, the crispness to the 603 vocals I mentioned before were completely gone. And the warmer sound of the Audiolab just balanced with the Bowers fantastic to create a very pleasing listen to all types of music presentation, and I was very happy with this setup. However, the Musical Fidelity A1 showed me a different side to the Bowers, one that was more to my taste actually. The A1 has a very bold sound with quite a pumped up bass, but not in a bad way, in a way that makes music have this roundedness and vivacity. And that added some drive and some fullness to the bass from the Bowers, and also, to my biggest surprise, it added some deeper bass power, and this warmed the whole presentation and made it more pleasing. Maybe a downside to the A1 was back to that vocals. There was just a little bit of edge and just maybe a little bit of crispness coming through the vocal region with the A1 that definitely wasn't there with the Audiolab. But the A1, gave the Bowers a bit more of a lively, up front, pumped up type of sound, where the Audiolab was just nice and relaxed and smooth and forgiving. So it was interesting to listen to both. I could have happily listened to both amplifiers with the speakers. Both complemented them really well. I think, the more lively up front, bassy sound is more my cup of tea. I definitely preferred the A1 with the Bowers speakers, and I definitely would like to listen to that combination maybe on a Friday night or a Saturday night before going out, but maybe on a Sunday with a hangover, when I just want to chill, Netflix and chill type of mode all day on a Sunday. Well, that's where the Audiolab would be absolutely fantastic, just to relax and just take a breath, just take a step back. So both of those amplifiers I can very much recommend with these speakers. And I think this is also why I've really been enjoying listening to vinyl through the Bowers speakers, because the vinyl setup I have here at the moment, it's got a bit of extra character to it, a bit of a rounded, nice, warm, pleasing character. And again, that just balances really nicely with the very neutral, really quite lively Bowers speakers. I could go into a deep comparison here between the Bowers and my own Mission 770, but really these are chalk and cheese speakers, both in looks and sound. The Missions don't do everything quite technically as good as the Bowers, who take their music a little bit more seriously, but the Missions have a greater sense of ease about them. They have a bit more of a special character to the vocals and definitely a more easygoing top end. And I think they definitely have the nicer finish of the two, but they also cost almost twice as much. But what's interesting is, sonically, the Bowers hold their own with the more expensive speakers in a lot of ways. To conclude then, the Bowers 603 S3, of course you can niggle them. You can say that their sound is very serious with the wrong partnering equipment. You can say they cost significantly more than the previous model. Obviously that was years ago. And you could say that the finished quality is not the best you're going to see for a speaker at this price. I think those are all fair criticisms. However, they can be a whole host of fun if you use them with the right amplifier, like the Musical Fidelity A1. They sound fantastic with that amplifier. And I just think they are very technically accomplished speakers for the price point. The hi-fi sound that they create, the three-dimensional soundstage that they create, with the amount of clarity that they can create, really is just very impressive. Regardless of price, it is very impressive. So it's priorities. What are your priorities here? What sort of speakers do you like? Do you want clarity? Do you want resolution? Do you want speed? Do you have a system that can add warmth and character to them? Are you already a Bowers 603 S2 owner? Well, then you're going to get a more refined, more clear, more precise speaker with the new S3 model. And I've had a whole host of fun. I've been here for a number of weeks. I've had a whole host of fun with them. And yeah, they would be on my shortlist, I think, if I was shopping at this price point. So I hope you've enjoyed this review. Hope you found it useful and helpful. If you enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up. And if you appreciate my take on hi-fi reviewing, subscribe to the channel.